Somewhere off the southern coast of Malaysia, 4 man-made islands rise out of the Strait of Johor. From above, they look like the future. Glass towers wrapped in vertical gardens, wide empty boulevards, a skyline built for 1 million people. But get closer, and something feels wrong. The streets are silent, the windows are dark. At night, an entire city built for 1 million residents lights up for maybe 20,000. This is Forest City, a $100 billion bet that became one of the most infamous ghost towns on Earth. And the story of how it got here is not just about bad luck. It's about ambition, geopolitics, and a housing crash on the other side of the world that reached across an ocean and gutted a city before it ever had a chance to live. Let's go back to where it started. In 2006, a joint venture was formed between the Chinese property giant Country Garden and a Malaysian conglomerate called Esplanade Danga 88, tied to the Sultan of Johor. The plan was staggering in scope. Reclaim land from the sea, off the coast of Johor, directly across the water from Singapore, and build a brand new city from nothing. Not a neighborhood, not a district, an entire city, homes for up to 700,000 people, built on 4 artificial islands totaling around 14 square kilometers of reclaimed land. Construction broke ground in 2014, and the project officially launched to buyers in 2016. The sales pitch was built almost entirely around one idea: proximity to Singapore. Forest City sits roughly 2 kilometers by water from one of the most expensive, most restrictive property markets on the planet. Singapore has sky-high real estate prices and strict rules for foreign buyers. Forest City offered the opposite: spacious apartments, resort-style amenities, golf courses, and a price tag a fraction of anything across the strait. The marketing leaned hard into eco-city of the future branding. Vertical gardens climbing the towers, car-free zones, smart infrastructure, sustainability at the center of every rendering. And it worked, at least at first, but not with the buyers anyone expected. The overwhelming majority of Forest City's early sales came from mainland Chinese buyers. Reports at the time suggested that in some early sales periods, well over 70% of buyers were from China, drawn by aggressive marketing campaigns run inside China itself, and by a simple financial calculation. Property in Forest City was cheap compared to Chinese cities, and it came with the promise of a foothold near Singapore. Then the wheels started coming off, and the first hit came not from Malaysia, but from Beijing. In 2018, China's government tightened capital controls, making it dramatically harder for Chinese citizens to move large sums of money out of the country to buy overseas property. Almost overnight, Forest City's core customer base was cut off at the source. That was the first blow. The second came from Malaysia itself. Also in 2018, Malaysia's government announced that foreign buyers would be barred from purchasing property, specifically within the Forest City zone, under a special visa arrangement, a policy shift tied to a change in national leadership that year. The 2 biggest legs holding up Forest City's sales strategy were kicked out within months of each other. Then came the third blow, and this one was fatal. Country Garden, the Chinese developer behind Forest City, was, at its peak, one of the largest real estate companies in the world. But starting in 2021, China's property sector entered a historic crisis. Developers that had grown by taking on enormous debt to fund constant expansion suddenly couldn't refinance. Evergrande's default made headlines first, but Country Garden was right behind it. By 2023, Country Garden was defaulting on its own debt obligations, with liabilities reported in the hundreds of billions of dollars across its global operations. A company that could barely keep its projects funded inside China had far less appetite and far less cash to keep pouring money into an ambitious city-building project in another country. The result is the Forest City we see today. A partially built metropolis, frozen mid-construction, with occupancy numbers that vary wildly depending on who you ask and when you ask them. Some reports from Malaysian officials and Forest City's own government-linked reporting have cited figures approaching 20,000 residents in 2026 across tens of thousands of completed units. Other independent visitor accounts and journalist investigations have put the real, day-to-day lived-in population far lower. In some cases, estimating only a few thousand people actually residing there full-time, with much of the occupied housing stock owned by absentee investors who never moved in. It's worth being upfront here. The exact occupancy figure for Forest City is genuinely disputed and depends heavily on the source and the year. What's not disputed is the scale of the gap between what was promised, a city for 700,000, and what exists on the ground today. Walk through Forest City now, and the split between promise and reality is visible everywhere. The towers are real, the golf course is real, the international school is real, with children of expatriate families, and a small number of local professionals attending classes in a city built for a population it never reached. Duty-free shops sit inside vast retail complexes designed for foot traffic that never arrived. Maintenance crews still clean streets and tend landscaping in buildings where entire floors sit vacant because the developer needs the city to still look sellable to the investors and family offices it's now courting. There have been real infrastructure problems too. Reports of structural cracking and road subsidence linked to the speed and method of the original land reclamation, the same reclamation that environmental groups warned back in the mid-2010s, would damage the mangrove forests and seagrass beds that once supported marine life along that stretch of coastline. But the story hasn't simply ended in failure. And this is the part most viral videos about Forest City leave out. In 2024, the Malaysian government designated Forest City as a special financial zone, folding it into a much larger cross-border economic initiative with Singapore called the Johor-Singapore Special Economic Zone. That's a meaningful shift. It moves Forest City from being a single failed developer's gamble to being a government-backed strategic asset, with tax incentives designed to attract financial institutions, family offices, and corporate tenants, rather than just residential buyers. Commercial rents inside the zone have reportedly risen sharply since that designation, and multiple family offices have received regulatory approval to base operations there. Whether that's enough to fill hundreds of thousands of empty apartments is still an open question. But it does mean Forest City's next chapter may look less like a residential utopia and more like a financial and logistics hub riding on Johor's border with Singapore. So what does Forest City actually teach us? It's tempting to call this a story about bad architecture or an over-the-top rendering that could never survive contact with reality. But that's not quite right. The engineering itself, the land reclamation, the tower construction, the golf courses and schools, largely got built as planned. What failed was the demand model underneath it, a project that bet its entire future on one country's outbound capital, one government's visa policy, and one developer's ability to keep expanding on debt forever. When all three of those assumptions collapsed within a few years of each other, no amount of good engineering could fill the towers with people. Forest City isn't a ghost town because the buildings failed. It's a ghost town because the economics around it did. If you found this breakdown of one of the world's strangest megaprojects interesting, subscribe to Engineered Future. We cover the biggest, boldest, and sometimes most doomed engineering projects on the planet, and we'll keep bringing you the real story behind the headlines. See you in the next one.